In this dark and cold room, where the only sound breaking the silence was Abigail's weak and irregular breathing, the situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Abigail, already in her final moments, knew she needed urgent medical help. With her weak, trembling, and increasingly distant voice, she called her son, Calvin, who was sitting with his arms crossed in the opposite corner of the room. "Calvin, please, I need an ambulance. I'm very ill," she murmured with difficulty, struggling to make each word heard. Calvin, with a vacant and disinterested look, barely raised his eyes to face his mother. The rancor between them was not new. Years of disagreement and disappointment had created a chasm. With a cold air, he replied curtly, "Mom, you're always making a drama. It's just a bad feeling, it'll pass. I don't need to call anyone." Abigail's weakness prevented her from insisting, but the pain in her eyes was evident. She knew the end was near, and her only son's indifference only added to her anguish. Abigail tried to speak one last time. "Calvin, don't be so hard. I really need help," she stammered, her voice barely capable of forming words. Calvin looked at his mother, his face marked by impatience. "I told you, Mom, it's nothing. You've always been like this, wanting attention. Not today. I'm tired of your act." Calvin's harsh words were the last Abigail heard. Her heart was heavy not only with the fear of imminent death, but with the pain of seeing her son so distant and cold. The loneliness of the moment was palpable, and as her breathing became more and more shallow, the darkness of the room seemed to consume all remaining hope. These walls, silent witnesses to abandonment and despair, would forever hold the story of a son who refused his mother's last plea for help. After Abigail's death, Calvin, still in shock, found himself in front of the family lawyer, a middle-aged man with a grave face and observant look. Sitting in an austere room where thick legal books were stacked on the shelves, Calvin awaited the reading of the will, hoping his mother had left him her modest house and savings. The lawyer, with a premonitory sigh, began to read the document, his voice resonating with formality. "I, Abigail, declare that my will excludes my son Calvin Alves from any direct inheritance. This decision was not taken lightly, but as a direct consequence of his actions and choices. Instead, I leave the majority of my estate to the local charity for emergency medical aid." Calvin paled, his eyes widening in disbelief, and he interrupted the lawyer. That must be a mistake. My mother would never do this to me. We had our problems, but... Mr. Alves, the lawyer intervened with impenetrable calm. There is no mistake. Your mother was very clear in her instructions and reasons. She expressed her profound disappointment and concern over your refusal to help her when she needed it. This clause was a direct response to your behavior. Anger began to rise in Calvin, his hands trembling as he tried to process the news. He stood up abruptly, slamming his hands on the table. "This is ridiculous. How could she do this to me? How could she judge our entire lives based on a single moment?" The lawyer, maintaining his calm, replied, "Calvin, every testamentary decision is the final reflection of a life, not just a moment. Your mother felt this was the best way to express her final wishes." The impact of his mother's will not only excluded him financially, but also served as a devastating mirror of his personal failures, leaving him with a torturous mix of anger, confusion, and deep reflection on the consequences of his actions. After the explosive encounter with the lawyer, Calvin found himself isolated in his living room, his face illuminated by the faint crackling of the fireplace. The revelation of his mother's will echoed in his mind, fueling a volcano of emotion on the verge of erupting. Moving restlessly around the room, he began to verbalize his fury, talking to himself in a bitter monologue. "How could she do this to me? After all, I was her son, her only son," he exclaimed, throwing old photos on the table as if searching for an accusing face to respond. Eva, his longtime friend, arriving unexpectedly, heard his words and decided to intervene with a gentle but firm voice. "Calvin, is it just about the money, or is it because you weren't there when she needed you most?" Calvin turned abruptly, surprised and irritated by the interruption. "Eva, you don't understand. She excluded me from everything. How do you expect me to react?" Eva, approaching cautiously, tried to clarify the situation. "I know it hurts, but maybe it's time to reflect, don't you think? Your mother made a radical choice, yes, but what about you? Your actions were drastic too, Calvin." Calvin sank into the couch, covering his face with his hands. After a long silence, his voice came out in a low rumble. "I never thought she would take it so seriously. I thought she was acting." Eva sat beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes, Calvin, we don't realize the weight of our actions until we are faced with their consequences. Your mother felt alone, and that's a difficult thing to face." The conversation with Eva allowed Calvin to confront his emotions in an unexpected way. Though still driven by anger, he began to realize that this anger was also a mirror of his unresolved guilt and pain. It was a painful but necessary first step to understand the impact of his own actions and what he had truly lost. In the days following the will's revelation, Calvin spent a lot of time alone, deep in thought. His mother's harsh words, written on paper, resonated in his mind, painfully making him aware of his failures. He began to realize that the initial anger was giving way to a deep reflection on his life and values. In search of clarity, Calvin decided to revisit the places he and his mother used to frequent together, seeking to understand and reconnect with the memories of a happier time. "She always loved this place. She said the plants teach us about renewal and growth. Maybe I need to learn that too." With each step and each leaf, he observed, he began to internalize the metaphors of growth and change that his mother so appreciated. Her words in the will, however harsh, were starting to become an ultimate lesson in responsibility and maturity. That afternoon, sitting on a bench in the shade of a large tree, Calvin pulled an old notebook from his pocket and began to write a letter to his mother, not expecting a response, but as a way to express his feelings. "Dear Mom, it has taken me a long time to understand the lessons you tried to teach me while you were here. I distanced myself when you needed me most, and for that, I feel a guilt that consumes me. I am beginning to see how my choices affected not only our relationship, but also myself. I hope to find a path that will lead me to redemption, just as the plants in this garden find ways to bloom each spring." Through this personal journey of recognizing his faults and regrets, Calvin began to understand the extent of his mother's decisions. With each word he wrote, he felt lighter, as if each sentence helped rebuild the bridge between him and his mother's memory. It was a slow and often painful process, but necessary for him to begin healing the wounds opened by years of misunderstanding and inadequacy. In the following months, Calvin dedicated himself intensely to his journey of self-awareness and reconciliation with the past. Therapy became an integral part of his life, helping him untangle layers of resentment and better understand his own motivations and failures. The realization that his mother's will's outcome was not just a punishment, but a final effort to teach him something began to make sense. Inspired by his therapy sessions, Calvin decided to launch a project in his mother's memory. With the money he had saved, he created a fund to help people facing medical emergencies who couldn't afford care, reflecting the situation his mother had faced. Calvin discussed this project with his therapist during a session. "I've thought a lot about how to turn this pain into something positive. My mother loved helping people, and this seems like a way to carry on her legacy." The therapist, a man with a calm voice and thoughtful gestures, nodded approvingly. "Calvin, this is a very powerful way to honor your mother while confronting your own failures and learning from them. You're learning to transform guilt into action, which is an important step in healing." Excited and motivated by this new goal, Calvin worked hard on the project, organizing fundraising events and raising community awareness about the importance of quick access to emergency medical services. During one of these events, as he watched the community come together to support the cause, he spoke with a volunteer and shared his feelings. Seeing all this, knowing we're helping someone in crisis in some way, I feel like I'm finally doing something right. It's like I'm reconciling with my mother. The volunteer, sharing Calvin's enthusiasm, replied, "You're turning your story into hope for many. That's something very beautiful and powerful." The redemption he sought manifested not only in his actions, but also in the transformation of his own worldview and relationships. He knew the road was long, but for the first time in many years, he felt he was on the right path.